Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all tuned in, all settled down for what I think is going to be a really lively and interesting session. I'm really pleased to be chairing today and looking forward to the speakers. We've got a fantastic panel of people from literally around the world to share with us thinking, ideas, thoughts, opportunities, risks around moving to more of an outcome-based way of measuring what colleges and learning providers do and thinking about accountability slightly differently. It's a really, really important piece of work that Learning and Work Institute have done for us, and we've worked with them on it. And I think there's a really, really important moment in time in England for this type of thinking, with the FE white paper introducing this idea of moving to much more of an outcome-based accountability set of measures for colleges and learning providers. But actually, we wanted to help inform that and make sure that it's done properly and done well, and that we learn from other people. So this report, I think, is a really, really important contribution to the debate and discussion. And I'm going to kind of hand over quite quickly to Stephen Evans, who's the Chief Executive of the Learning and Work Institute, to get us started. And I'll introduce our other speakers when we get to that point. But Stephen, straight over to you, and let's get on with it.
Great, thanks very much, David. And a huge thanks to the Association of Colleges for their support for this piece of work. It's greatly appreciated. I just wanted to summarise really the arguments we were making in the report and some of the recommendations we were drawing out. And you'll be delighted to know I'm only going to do this in 5 slides. We no more than 5 slides, and then we can get on to the discussion. So there we go. So the first slide, a bit about the context. So David mentioned a bit of this earlier. So the Skills for Jobs white paper back earlier this year said that the government wanted to reform the accountability system, focus more on the outcomes that providers achieve, and mention specifically progression in learning and good labour market outcomes. Of course, this applies to England because the skills system is devolved across the rest of the United Kingdom. So we had that Skills for Jobs white paper, and we're now in the midst of 2 consultations, one on the National Skills Fund and one on funding and accountability. And it's the latter one that really talks about this accountability system and focus on outcomes. And so a long consultation, many of you will probably have read it, but I guess the sort of key features for me were, number one, asking local groups of employers to come up with skills improvement plans to say what they think are the skills needed in particular areas. Secondly, the government reaching accountability agreements with colleges about how colleges are going to meet local and national skills needs and what they're going to do for the money that they receive. And then thirdly, a skills measure. So looking at some of those outcomes, I'll go on to that in a moment, some of those labour market and progression in learning outcomes to back up the accountability agreement. The way I look at it is the accountability agreement is looking forward and saying what are colleges going to do, and the skills measure is kind of looking back and say what are the outcomes that have been achieved. And then I think the elephant in the room that I thought I'd get out of the way first is that the white paper itself, and all the rest of us I'm sure as well, do recognise that you can't just do all of this stuff and then it'll all be fine, but you do need some longer term funding, increased funding as well. My words, not the white papers. And ultimately, we'll see how the Department for Education gets along with the Treasury in the spending review next month as to whether that delivers increased and longer term funding for the skills system. So that's a bit about the context, and I'm really going to focus, and we're going to focus today on the funding and accountability bit and those outcome measures, but they do sit in that wider context, and I think that's important to note. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So why focus on outcomes? I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons, but I just tried to pick up some of the pros and cons here. I think for me, a greater focus on outcomes has the potential to help make the case for greater investment in further education and lifelong learning, because if you want to convince the Treasury then the Treasury needs to see what's the return on investment, what's it doing for the economy, how's it helping people get jobs, how's it helping deliver savings across other public services potentially. So there's a kind of case for investment point. The second point, which is about enabling colleges and providers to join up with other public services. So if you're focused on a particular outcome, whether getting a job might be one outcome, then having that outcome as the focus maybe allows providers and colleges to work more closely with Job Centre Plus and other services rather than being tied to very specific requirements on their funding. Thirdly, I think, and this is where I think we're looking to extend the approach that the Department for Education talks about. For me, this allows us to have a broader measure about what's the ultimate impact of learning. I often talk about learning as being a sort of golden thread that ought to run through health and well-being, through how we reduce crime, how we increase communities, all of these different things. So helping to recognise that and measure some of that where we can, again, helps to demonstrate our impacts as a sector. And then lastly, linked to the point about join up, could this help us to get local greater flexibility in delivery and focus on what people need rather than what commissioners and funders demand in the rules? Now, on the flip side of it, you can never capture the full range of impacts of learning. Learning has so many different impacts, and you could end up with a gazillion measures and you'd still miss several things out. Colleges and providers are never in full control of the delivery of a particular outcome. You know, somebody gets a job partly because of the course they've been on, partly because of the support they've had from tutors and careers advisors, but also for a bunch of other reasons. So you don't want to put too much weight on those things. We know from every sort of policy area you can imagine that there's always risk of perverse incentives. So if we start saying the one thing that matters from colleges is how many people have got jobs at the end, the risk is that means there's a kind of push to, if you're not work ready, well, we just can't afford to enrol you because we're going to look terrible on this scorecard, and the department's going to come and hit us with a stick and stop our funding. And then, of course, the last thing probably anyone running a college or a provider needs is another thing to be measured by or another set of paperwork to fill out. So that's why I do think there's the sort of stuff about longer term funding and simplifying the funding system needs to come hand in hand with any focus on outcomes. So I think there's some really positive opportunities here, but also some, as ever, some pitfalls to avoid. So then if we move on to the next slide, please. So this is where I'm in the slightly awkward position of I'm now going to talk about Canada and Australia, and there are two actual people from Canada or Australia who know far more about it than I do. So I'm going to apologise in advance, and they can correct me or kind of say how it really plays out in practice, as opposed to how it looks like on the paper or from a distance. But we thought it was helpful to try and illustrate or draw out some international examples where there is more of a focus on outcomes than perhaps there is within England. So within Australia, there's a kind of national strategy, that National Agreement for Skills and Workforce Development. There's a set of measures set out in there, which includes qualification attainment at various levels, employment outcomes, and progression onto other learning. And all of those measures are set out in a Productivity Commission dashboard. So it's all publicly available. You can kind of see it all side by side. And I think that national agreement is a sort of partnership or a co-investment between different levels of government as well. So it's done on a system level basis rather than a provider level basis. So I'll come on to that in a second. So I think there's kind of some lessons about openness of data and system level approaches there. And then Canada, again, agreements between the federal government and different levels of government there in the states and provinces, with funding devolved to them through workforce development agreements and labour market development agreements. So this is kind of funding for workforce development and also for employment insurance claimants as well, to try and get them back to work. And those agreements set out the funding, and it's a 3-year, I think, funding envelope, the sorts of things that will be funded, the sorts of target groups that provision is aimed at, and then the employment outcomes in particular that will be delivered through that, and it's all independently evaluated. You can go on Google and find out the evaluation of each of these frameworks and the difference that they've made in practice in each of the different parts of Canada. Then in fact, there might be people from Ireland and the US on the event who can also correct me about the second half of what I'm about to say here. This could be setting myself up for an absolute fall here. So we also looked at Ireland, where the government agency Solace has a 4-year strategy for investment in further education, then reaches regular strategic performance agreements with local employment and training boards to say which priority groups of learners are they going to try and go and engage, and what are their performance targets for getting people into work afterwards, into further learning, and in particular sectors as well, different priority sectors. So that's an example again of trying to link down from that national level strategy into frankly quite specific targets for performance at TTV level. Again, that's local system level as opposed to individual providers. And then lastly, in the US, a system of local workforce development boards within each state, funded through the federal government, and there's a kind of legal basis for that through the federal government, and a set of outcomes defined in that legislation for the investments in terms of employment, earnings, employer satisfaction with provision, and they're sort of testing a few different measures on that, and progression to further learning. And I think one of the interesting things here is all of that data is not just about how commissioners or governments judge providers, if you like, or hold them accountable or view their results. It's also intended to inform employer and individual choice. And if you go to trainingproviderresults.gov, you can search for nursing courses in New Jersey and see which providers there are, satisfaction, completion rates, earnings after completion, and all these different things. So I think there is a point about what is this focus on outcomes for? Is it for government to hold colleges and others accountable, or is it for individuals and employers to make decisions, or is it for something else? So I thought there's kind of a set of different interesting points there. Very superficial level, there's a bit more detail in the report. You're going to get a bit more detail on 2 of those countries shortly. But in the interest of time, I'll just skip on to the next slide, which tries to set out a few lessons that we drew. It'll be interesting to get everyone's perspective on this as well. So firstly, on the outcomes, what outcomes do we mean? So we were talking about economic and social outcomes, and but there's so many outcomes and you can measure them at so many different levels. How do you make sure that you get some simplicity so you can see the wood for the trees, but that you don't miss the point because you've missed the complexity and the value of what further education is doing? Secondly, what level does this accountability or outcomes focus hold at? So a lot of the examples I've given are at systems level, so they're local authority or state or province or whatever. Some are at provider level, but how do we marry that up within England, where you've got some areas with some things devolved and not other things, and then some areas with nothing devolved? So what level are we trying to measure these outcomes? Thirdly, scope. So are we talking about all skills funding, or are we talking about the adult education budget, or are we talking about employment learning and skills more broadly? And do apprenticeships sit a bit differently, or does basic skills learning mean something a bit different? So what's the scope? Fourthly, I talked a bit about use. So what's the point of this basically? What are we trying to use it for? Is it for providers to have a look at themselves and think, oh, I'd like to focus a bit more on that? Is it for commissioners to sort of intervene or help where they think things are going off track, or give more funding where things are going particularly well? Is it a payment by results model where we've seen various shortfalls of that in other fields, or is it this informed choice point for individuals and employers? And then lastly, consequences. So it's all well and good having a set of measures and a dashboard with various bits of green and orange on it, or red, but what actually happens if there's a load of red on there? And the more consequences you have for doing less well by whatever the measures are, the more you have a risk of perverse consequences. But if there's no consequence whatsoever, then why even bothering with it? So I think there is a trade-off about what are we using this for, and what's the result if things are not quite going on track. So last slide just tries to summarize what we're suggesting off the back of that. We could perhaps go into more discussion on this in the rest of the event. So firstly, the DFE consultation talks primarily about employment or getting into work, and also progression to learning. We think that other social outcomes ought to be in there as well. We've got examples of having worked with community learning providers to measure health and wellbeing outcomes and social capital and things like that. Learning has so many different benefits. We think that we shouldn't lose sight of those social outcomes. And often what gets measured gets managed. So we don't want to sort of lose sight of that wider purpose of learning. And then we do think the scope should be relatively wide, because the risk is you sort of focus on outcomes in a silo and it doesn't give you the benefits that we need to have. So that's a bit about definitions. And then in terms of scope and level, so at the moment the proposal, I think, is that the Department for Education will have accountability agreements with each college, and I think they're starting with colleges but may extend it to independent providers over time. Kind of makes sense to have that, as long as it's got longer term funding and is relatively simple. We don't want an essay writing competition. This should be relatively limited and focused. But we've also argued for labour market and skills agreements based on the Canadian model, really, where we devolve more learning skills and employment funding to local areas based on the outcomes that they will deliver and tracking those over time. And we have levelling up everything's levelling up now, isn't it, in England anyway. So we have a levelling up white paper coming later in the autumn, which will have some proposals about devolution. I do think the Department for Education's plans for further education really need to be joined up with those levelling up and devolution plans more effectively than they perhaps have been. And then lastly, I think there's a point about use of data. So the Ministry of Justice has a data lab where if you're running a local project with ex-offenders, you can send some of their details, like their national insurance numbers, off to the Ministry of Justice, and they will tell you whether your participants were less likely to reoffend than a similar sort of control group. We think that's a really good model and could really help build the evidence base in employment and skills as well. So why doesn't the DFE and the DWP do that jointly? DWP's already been developing an employment data lab for a few years. Why doesn't DFE join up with that? And then you as a college can send in the details of some of your learners, and they can tell you against a sort of comparison group whether your learners were more likely to get a job or a pay rise or whatever it happens to be. So we can learn as we go rather than doing an evaluation at the end. Though as an organisation that does lots of evaluations, we think we should definitely keep doing that as well. So that's a really whistle-stop tour through a really complicated set of subjects, but hopefully illustrates some of the issues that we think are particularly live here and some of the directions we could go in and some of the trade-offs, and really looking forward to the rest of the discussion and getting into that. So over to you, David.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. That's fantastic. And I would definitely recommend you have a look at the report. Just it goes into some more detail on that. But that was a really nice way of presenting it. Just to remind you, if you've got questions or if you've got comments, you can use Slido. Please do sort of start populating that, and we'll keep an eye on those questions so that when Craig, Denise and Zoe have finished, we've got some nice questions to grill them, as well as Stephen, on all of this. What we've got now is three great speakers. Craig Robertson, who's the Chief Executive of Victorian Skills Authority. He was doing a very similar job to me and to Denise, actually, in Australia with the TAFE, which are similar in many ways to general FE colleges until quite recently, and he's gone to the dark side again, which everyone does from time to time, because I think you can see an opportunity there in Victoria, because they've got, I think, quite an enlightened minister, which is exciting. Denise does a very similar job to me with College and Institutes Canada, and will speak about Canada, and Zoe, who's principal in Middlesbrough College, will kind of follow up. So we've got about 4 or 5 minutes from each, and then we want to get into wider discussion and debate. So please do start asking those questions or just making comments, because I think this is a discussion. It's not just a question and answer session. So I'm going to hand over now to Craig for 4 or 5 minutes. Craig, the floor is yours.
Good on you. Thank you, David. And congratulations, Stephen. I read the report during the day. and you've done a very good job of describing the Australian context. So very well done. And in fact, when I was back in the dark side at the federal level, I was involved in setting up that agreement. And the way that you described it is very good. And that agreement, an outcomes-based agreement, is essentially a financial relationship between the federal government and the states or the provinces. And it came about in about 2007, 2008, and a change of federal government, because prior to that, the funding agreements or the transfer of funding had a lot of input controls on it, even to the extent that the federal government was trying to drive its quite draconian industrial relations reform through conditions attached to funding. And so the new government came in and said, let's look at these outcomes. Let's give the states and territories the flexibility to meet these outcomes. And you'll see, as you describe them, a lot of them are population-based outcomes. So that worked quite well. However, the sad news is that the body that was set up to monitor it was abolished soon after there was another change of government to the current government we've got of the centre-right at present. And they are currently trying to negotiate a new agreement. And surprise, surprise, they're going back to input measures. And most states and territories that are the recipients of that funding are resisting that agreement being signed, because fundamentally they're going to lose their local flexibility. And in the context of each state and territory wanting to recover in different ways from COVID, there's actually real pressure in that agreement. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of it. But I do want to sort of make a point about acknowledging and welcoming the principle about the outcomes approach. And my bit of advice or guidance is around this notion of genuine outcomes. Slight problem that we've ended up in Australia is we think we've created this one-to-one relationship, that training and a job, any job. And we know that there are a lot of factors that impact the capacity for someone to get a job, their socio-economic circumstances, but also the attractiveness of the job. And in a low-wage economy that all of us are in at the moment, that's quite a challenge. So we're trying to look at, and particularly in my new role, this notion of value add. Where has a student started from, and what has the training or the education intervention got them to? There's that one. The encouragement to look at long-term outcomes, because it may well be the training gets somebody into a job because that's their attachment to the labour market, but then they move forward. And what is interesting in that regard is where Australia is heading to with the benefit of what we would call big data. In Australia, believe it or not, even if we're in a federation, every student in VET has a unique identifier. So we can track them over their lifetime. With that data, including what has been the training intervention or the educational intervention, they are, within privacy rules, they are doing data matching into our tax office. So you can actually now track the longer term, essentially wage outcomes for individuals, and that can provide that longer term perspective. And so that's going to be very interesting to see what plays out. Now, part of the challenge will be that some people might use that data to say it's the provider that's at fault. My point I've been trying to make is that can actually point out that the qualification that's been assigned to be delivered might be at fault. So it does give you a rich sense of how you can adjust your delivery. Just an aside, when you were talking about the American example, I referred back to 2014. The Obama administration need to put some outcome measures in place to stop runaway student loans through a number of private for-profit colleges. And so they established what they called some gainful employment rules. And a college could potentially lose its funding or access to student loans if the loan exceeded a certain percentage of their income. In other words, to avoid being caught in a debt trap, which I thought was an interesting approach. Love your idea about the data lab, because really what's going on now is all of that use of rich and deep data, and all governments in Australia are doing that. My other bit of a word of caution, and you picked up on this in your presentation, is to try to resist somehow government saying, sure, we can go to outcomes-based funding, but by the way, we want to have all these input controls as well. So there sort of has to be this trade-off. Okay, we're happy to be measured on outcomes, the longer-term outcomes, but in return for this autonomy and this subsidiarity notion so that you can meet local conditions. If you end up with both, as you warned, that could be quite a load. But congratulations on the report, and there are actually some things I'll be interested in following up with you later. Actually, thank you, David.
Thanks, Craig. That's really, really helpful, and I'm sure we'll get more out of you before the end of this next hour or so. So I'm going to hand over to Denise, who, as I said, is President CEO of Colleges and Institutes Canada, which is a similar organisation to AOC. So I know some of your pain, Denise. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, David, and thank you for your invitation. So a couple of things first for Canada. When we talk about colleges, we mean polytechnics, community colleges, colleges of applied educations, or CEGEPs, so different nomenclature. The reasons for that is because in Canada, education is of provincial and territorial jurisdiction, and there is no federal Ministry of Education or federal Ministry of Higher Education. And we are one of the rare countries in the world, in fact, without a federal Ministry of Education. So much of education's funding in Canada, in fact, comes from provinces, except, of course, for research and special initiatives such as infrastructure, where the federal government would provide funding. This means that provincial funding is tied to enrollment of students, and the rest of the funding comes from tuition fees and other sources of revenues, such as international students or adult education. So when we talk about labor market development agreements, those are agreements, in fact, between the federal government and the provinces, by which the funding flows from the federal, but it does not go to post-secondary institutions per se. The funding goes from the province to initiatives that help individuals unemployed that want to go back to labor market. In fact, I was myself in government when we were making those transfers to the province. I was in the federal government, and we proceeded with devolutions to provinces. So in 2019, Ontario, which is one of the provinces in our country, announced it was moving to a performance-based funding for both colleges and universities based on a set of 10 metrics. And of course, because of the pandemic, it was put on hold. And it seems now that this new funding model will take effect in 2022, 23. And now we also hear that Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick, they also want to take such an approach. And we know, for example, that in the case of Alberta, it's to reduce funding to institutions, and they were quite clear about that. And There is a current perceptions that provinces moving with such a model are not valuing higher educations for the betterment of society, but they prefer growth of the economy and labor markets. And what is important to know, though, for Canada, when we talk about funding to public institutions that come from the province, it varies across the country. I told you educations was different in our 13 jurisdictions, 10 provinces and 3 territories. But the funding, the public funding vary from an amount of 40% of public funding for public institutions to 88%, depending on which provinces or which territories. So this means that if you do not receive a large amount from the government, the impact on your funding based on performance will be greatly diminished. So all that to say, the point that I'd like to make here is that there are currently already measures in place now in Canada that ensure more accountability for learners and impacts on economy. And Stephen, you talk about some of those in your paper. So we have, for example, mandate letters or agreements between individual institutions and government that are kind of those accountability agreements. They are also for every single program that we have in place, and we have over 10,000 of them across the country. They are what we call program advisory committees. So it means we have 10,000 program advisory committees. Those are made up of people from the industry, from the community, and they provide advice on the curriculum, on the labor market, on the trends, on equipment even, and also on the type of internship, on skills. And so this in itself is a measure that ensures that whatever is taught is done according to the needs of the labor market. On top of it, there are what we call KPIs, key performance indicators, and obligations for colleges, not for universities, but for colleges. It's compulsory to put on the website for every single college per program the job placement of graduates within 6 months, the employer satisfactions of graduates, and the graduate satisfactions of their program. So this means a lot of accountability. And if you're a learner, you can check, if I go in program X, what is my likelihood of finding a job? And there are some that even locate the job within a certain radius of the place where you live. And so, as I said, already a lot of measures. And for me, when I hear about performance-based models that some provinces or some countries want to embark, I always question the benefits for the learners and the communities when we already have accountability measures in place. And Stephen, you were right on the spot with your first slide. So thank you.
Thanks, Denise. That's fantastic. I'm going to hand on to Zoe in a second. I just wanted to be sort of very candid, really, because we know that there are risks with moving to outcome measures, and I know that lots of our members are quite worried about it. But what we wanted to try and do was to kind of open up the debate and bring that out into the open. And Zoe's going to try and do that kind of magical trick of being kind of setting out her concerns, but not being negative, and it's really quite difficult to achieve, Zoe, but thank you for agreeing to try, and look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Okay, thank you. That's suitably expectations put right in the place there. Yeah. So I thought I would talk about a couple of things, really. Middlesbrough College is located in one of the areas of highest deprivation in the country. We're also in a place that had a LEP, a local enterprise partnership, I think in the first wave, and we were in the first wave of devolution, which are all relevant to the story I'd like to tell and the learning journey that we've been on as an organisation. And I think, if I'm sure they would agree, the Local Enterprise Partnership and the people who are responsible for devolved skills funding and policy have been on as well. So if I tell a little story, hopefully it'll become clear why it's relevant. So our LEP's been around for 8 years. It created a strategic economic plan. That plan proposed 25,000 new jobs with a big proportion at a higher level. It probably, now we've seen more LEP plans, isn't very different to many of the other areas in terms of the sectors it's focusing on and the types of issues it's grappling with and attempting to work together to resolve. So we've been on a real journey, and right at the start, it was quite a very narrow narrative. It was from, very influential employers, local policymakers. It was, if only colleges did these courses, everything would be better. The jobs would be better, economy would be better, more people would come here and invest. And the problem was the lack of throughput from the colleges or kind of system-based, provider-based. So that was the kind of narrative, I'm probably oversimplifying, that we faced sort of in 2013. And I have to say, I was a new principal then, and I actually believed a lot of that. And I think that's quite important. I really genuinely believe that colleges didn't do enough STEM and that we needed to get more higher level and we needed to do these various things. So I really believed it. Personally, as an organisation, as a governing body, we put £20 million into a STEM strategy to focus more on engagement with employers, to focus on expanding apprenticeships, to focus on technical careers and retraining adults from people from industry to come and train to teach. So that was a big commitment and a big investment. And I look at the college now. Back then, 25% of our school leavers were in STEM, priority sectors identified by our LEP. Today, 2/3 of our school leavers are in priority sectors identified by the LEP. That is a hell of a shift in our student makeup, all because I really believed that would make a difference. We really believe that would make a difference. So that's been a real journey of sort of learning. So what do we know now? We're 8 years on. We're data rich. We've been talking and meeting monthly. We know a lot. So we know we're still an area of high deprivation. We know we've got high unemployment. We know we've got more economically inactive people. We know we've got, and this is really crucial, low job density. I didn't know that phrase. We've got, if everybody was in work, we still got more people than we have jobs. Okay, that's very different to other areas of the country. I'll come back to that. We know we've got a low working age population. So fewer people are graduates, more people don't have the basic skills. We know that. But we also know we've got higher performance than average and participation in HE. Now there's an interesting thing, isn't it? So over the years, we've been working together across the area to progress up to level 3 and higher, and it's working. We've got a higher than average participation in HE. But, and here's the but, we've got more people leave the area still. We're a net exporter of skills. And we've also got lower skills shortages being reported in our companies. I don't know how they collect that. That's a caveat, but that's in the report of the local LEP. So I think over the years, colleges here have done what they've been asked to do, and providers as well, because they're part of the network. We've shifted provision, we've listened, we've increased progression, we've got more flexible, adaptable HE, and it's working as far as you can measure the outcomes from a college perspective. It hasn't yet helped any of the indicators that we're talking about. We've still got people leave the area. We've still got unemployed graduates. We've got underemployed people. We've still got 42% of our economy is low wage churn. We don't even need educating to level 2. So we've still got some underlying issues here. So the question really becomes, what do we want to do about it? And I think if you were asking me the question in 2013, I would have said a data dashboard will improve things. I'm now not sure it will. In fact, I'm almost sure it won't. I actually think it'll have the reverse effect. So why do I say that? So we track our destinations. Every year from 2013, our destinations have improved, well, since we started, which was 14-15, roughly by about 1% a year. So by 1% a year, we've been getting more people into jobs in university. If you look at Tees Valley's unemployment rate, it's dropped slightly more sharply than the national rate. So I could sit here and say, aren't we doing well? We're closing the gap. But what I also know, and I find it very difficult to ignore, is that demographics, You know, I think macroeconomics are really important. The number of school leavers leaving college and entering the workforce, leaving university and entering the workforce have dropped for 10 years, and they've dropped more sharply in the Tees Valley. So which of those do you think has impacted on employment? Do you think it's colleges doing a great job and flexing their courses, or do you think it's the fact that fewer people are entering the workforce and more people are staying on in university? I think I might sort of hazard a guess around that. The other thing we've learned on this journey is we do very, I have to say, bureaucratic, admin heavy documents for our devolved adult education budget. But that whole exercise has taught us a lot. So it is heavy burden, but it's also interesting, and you get into the purpose of what we're doing. So if I just give you an example, we've got huge ESOL numbers, not compared to London, but compared to our area at the college. 11% of ESOL learners will get a job after their course. Okay, let me just pick another one. Access learners, none will get a job. 92% will go to university. Let's pick another one. Functional skills learners, 10 to 20% will get a job. The rest will generally progress up the levels. Maybe be a bit, you know, we do a lot of work with charities around long-term addiction, lots of other things like that. So the variation between level, type of learner, course is huge. So the mix and balance of providers and this need for a simple measure is just going to miss out the sophistication of our skills system. So that's part of the journey. I've just got a few more things. So I look at the sphere of influence and I look at our unemployment here. So, you know, number one, how many people are entering the economy? Number two, how many jobs are there? The third one is employer behaviour, terms and conditions. You know, we're seeing it right now. Education at the moment hasn't suddenly got worse at educating care workers, but people are leaving the profession and not enough are going in. Same with drivers, same with hospitality. It's not actually to do with what colleges are doing, it's to do with other factors. We know education policy. I was really pleased to see in the report that it does clearly identify some of the causal effects, that there's been a reduction in government funding and a reduction in employer training budgets over many decades. It's great to see that. What I couldn't find was the link between this outcome-based performance measure and actually those two causes of the problems we're trying to solve. But apprenticeships policy has halved apprenticeships in the northeast of England. They're harder to get than ever before. Adult learner loans, HE loans, halved the number of people on evening classes, literally overnight, completely outside of colleges' control. And this kind of lack of second chance education is a really big thing. So if you get it wrong, it's very difficult now for you to retrain unless you take on debt. So there's some really big policy issues here that are impacting people's decisions that we've got zero influence over. And then on top of that, we look at our courses. So we've got a big play at the moment, digital courses. The number of people taking digital courses post-16 is going down every year in the country. And right now we need it to go up. We're trying everything. We're in coding clubs in schools. We're doing employer expos. We can't turn that tide because there's something around the secondary education system, performance measures, GCSE curriculum that's fueling that we've got no control over. So that's just a real example I wanted to throw in. So, you know, I have this thing about weighing the pig. What this does is a bit worse than weighing the pig. It's weighing half the pig. It's not weighing the ones that do A levels or go to university. So we're still saying in this model, it's acceptable to go and do a chemical engineering degree and get a job in marketing, which, you know, I can think of a few people who might have that. So, and that's not unusual. About a quarter of STEM graduates get a job in business or finance, and that's very acceptable. But what our system is saying increasingly is that at the age of 15, if you're not in that half of the country, you have to make a decision, you have to get on the right course and you have to stick in that career because there's no second chance education. And worse still, then it's putting the emphasis on colleges on getting that right. So I do worry about weighing half the pig. And I do worry about the unintended consequences, which for me, I can put really simply, could really be levelling down. You know, we're a graduate exporter because people don't need a performance dashboard to know that they're more likely to get a job in London than in Middlesbrough. They don't need a performance dashboard. If you give a performance dashboard, it will make colleges in deprived areas look worse than non-deprived areas. That won't make the outcome better. Actually, it will make the outcome better because people will move, but it won't make the whole country outcome better. So if we want to make the whole country outcome better and improve social mobility and level up, we have to think differently. So the constructive part of the ending is, I do think there is something about these measures. I really do. And I still, I hanker back to my views back in 2013. There is something in that we should all be aware of. But for me, it's critically important it's kept at a regional level. It's critically important that what they do is fuel really deep and meaningful strategic conversations that in turn build trust, because that's what's lacking in all of this and driving all of this. And I think even your report said that some unfair concerns is the driver behind this. Let's address those unfair concerns and let's look at what we're actually trying to achieve. If you make them public, there will be unintended consequences, and they won't be fair because of the mix and balance of provision. And I'd love to refocus this intellectual capacity that's all taken up a lot of our time to actually address some of the underlying issues, which, for example, health. We know we can commission health differently. We've got a government who's the employer, the commissioner, and the funder of training. So let's look at some of those and let's look at how we can address some of the underlying issues. Thanks,
Zoe. That's great. Lots and lots of issues come out there. I mean, my take just very quickly, and there's some really good questions coming through, so please do keep those questions coming through. My take on it is that there are some fundamental kind of parts of the system that are not in place to make an outcome measure work effectively in England. And we need to see the whole system set up properly. I do worry that part of the reason why the government is interested in it, and it was interesting, Denise, you saying that some of your provinces are interested about trying to save money. There's always that fear that they think that too much money is being wasted on something because they can't see the outcome of it. And yet actually some of that supposed waste might be transforming people's lives. So I think there's a kind of I've yet to meet a college principal in anywhere in the world who doesn't want to be accountable for what they do, who doesn't want to, sing and shout about the amazing things they do for their learners and with their employers. It's how you do it that matters so much. And then the other big thing I think in England that sort of struck me from Denise and Craig was the kind of who are colleges going to be accountable for in this system. And I know, Stephen, you talked about it. It just feels we've got such a fragmented system. Devolution in England is a mess. I mean, there's no other word for it. It's a patchwork quilt of half-baked ideas, and some of it works quite well and lots of it doesn't work very well at all. Some areas aren't covered in any way by any devolution. Other areas have got two or three layers. So until we understand who it's to, and at the moment it looks as though it will be to sort of the DFE and ESFA, who I don't think has got the capacity to have those strategic conversations based on outcomes. So I think there's some really big issues. And then just two other things that I just wanted to kind of put into the mix, really. One is the cyclical nature of some of those outcomes. So if we've got, as we have now, very, very high vacancies and very low unemployment, we've got, kind of quite low participation rate in the labour market. But it's much more straightforward to get people into jobs than it would be, after the 2008 recession, for instance, when we had massive unemployment and not many vacancies. So how do you take that into account? Because the measures always lag the reality. So there's some big issues there. And then the bit that Zoe talked about a little bit is the regional inequalities and differences. So how do you cope with, and with some of the analysis we've done that shows, in your part of the world, Zoe, you will get worse labour market and salary outcomes than you would in London. What a surprise, or the sectoral ones. If you're doing social care, the wages will be worse than they will be than in accounting, for instance. So there's some big issues, I think, that I think we need to get to. We've got a few really good questions, so I'm going to sort of just throw them out. There's quite a nice one about whether any of us think the pandemic might have changed this. And I think the question sort of saying, does the focus on well-being, on health, on care, on some of those sectors that used to be frowned upon, does that change things? Does the skills for green jobs? And I just wondered if anyone wanted to have a stab at that one. Stephen, you look as though you're keen to have a go at it.
I always try to look keen, and sometimes I manage it. No, I think so. Yes, I think so. We do a lot of work about the quality of work, as well as I think Craig was talking about this earlier, actually. So not just what's the employment rates, but what's the quality of work, and that's about more than earnings. Earnings matter, but it's about more than earnings. So we published a better work audit for London last week, for example, looking at some of those measures and sort of well-being, and we did some work a few years ago with I think it's about 13 community learning providers across England to test using some of the NHS's metrics about health and well-being for learners at the start and end of provision to see, well, does this help demonstrate some kind of impact? And it did, and is it doable? And it was. And I think the reason that mattered is because we know learning can help health and well-being, to give that as an example. But if you want to convince, as you know, Zoe talked about the NHS there, if you want to convince the NHS to do more social prescribing or to involve LIFA, you kind of need to talk their language. And their language was this health and well-being metric. So we thought, well, we'll kind of have a go at that then. So I think there was a kind of sort of convincing others point there. There is a sort of immediate thing about, you know, kind of filling the vacancies that you were talking about, which probably changes the set of priorities. Social care is a brilliant example, actually, where if we're going to measure, if anyone was proposing solely to measure colleges on earnings outcomes, the best thing any college could do would be to shut down its social care provision. And that's, we just undervalue social care as a country, don't we? We need to pay more, we need to pay people more, and we need to value them more. So that's a good example of where I'd love to think we're about to invest loads of money in social care and pay everyone the living wage. I fear we may have a little bit of a wait for that one, but it's a great example of where the context needs to be taken into account. You need to contextualise any of these outcomes, whether it's for local economics or for customer groups or learner groups or demographics or whatever it happens to be. That for me is a reason to contextualise things rather than to not do it at all. And if I may, sorry, just while I've got one sort of, I think it's a really pragmatic argument for why, for why this is important. So Zoe is completely and utterly correct that there's no point just publishing a dashboard that shows red because it's a deprived area and there's no funding and there's like 79 rule books or something. I think my pragmatic argument would be that the government is not going to put more funding in or reduce the rules or simplify it without something to do with outcomes or an accountability there. And it's got to be the right one, and it's not everything, and you can't put what a college does on a spreadsheet and a few numbers. That's absolutely correct. And one needs to go with the other. The risk, of course, is that we get loads of we've got funding and accountability consultation that's all accountability and no funding. So I think that's why you do need to tie these things together. And the pandemic will shift things in some unknown ways. And that's another reason not to set stuff in stone for the next 5 years, because we don't know what the next 5 years is going to look like. So we need to be pragmatic as we go along as well. For example, there's the DFE talk about priority skill sectors. I bet HGV drivers wasn't a priority skill sector 3 weeks ago, and it really definitely is now, because we can't get any petrol at the pumps and we've run out of stuff on the shelves. So that's another reason to be really pragmatic with this, I think, and flex as you go.
And Craig certainly talked about that, you know, don't load on outcome measures and input measures at the same time. You do need to get that balance right. I think there's another question that's come through, which I think kind of is really important here. There's a risk, isn't there, that we end up with politicians driving what they think learners should want to get out of learning. Yeah, you know, so the question says, you know, how do you accommodate curriculum intent and learner motivation? So I'm really interested, you know, I mean, Craig, Denise, Zoe, what do you think, how does it work in Australia and Canada? How do you get the outcome measures that actually match the input or the intent of learners? And the example I would give, and I think it's a really simple one, is how many adult learners want to do literacy in order to be able to read to their children. So reading to your children probably won't be one of the outcome measures, but it's a bloody important kind of transformational part of people's lives. Or helping with maths homework, you know, getting better maths and numeracy. You know, there are lots of intentions that people have and motivations that wouldn't fit with learner progression in learning or job outcomes. So is Craig or Denise or Zoe, is there any thoughts on that kind of issue?
I'll have a go and then let others. And I'm going to try to connect it back a bit to the other question about the impact of COVID. I think most politicians have been caught by, well, COVID has revealed the parlous state of some people in terms of insecure work and all that sort of stuff. The classic stuff in Australia has been sessional care workers who've had to work across different aged care facilities, and they transfer the infection across. And of course, they probably knew they were infectious, but they had to work because they were just so dependent upon that sessional work. So there's a bit of a sense. I do wonder whether Western countries that know they've got a problem with wage deflation are now right to be able to look at that. So that's number one. The second thing that strikes me a little bit when it comes to vet, and this is particularly in Australia, is this quite simplistic one-to-one intervention logic. There's a job, I train. That's surely so 1 + 1 sort of equals the result. And we know there's a whole pile of other attributes that are at play there, socioeconomic and all that sort of stuff. So maybe the power of big data, where administrative data sets and a whole pile of things can be collated and then regressed, you can then maybe start to tell those stories that Zoe was really revealing from her lived experience on the ground. That might help us become a little bit more sophisticated in what we think our intervention is, to move away from this 1 + 1 type logic. That might lead us to more of a generic liberal education approach rather than just focus so solely on the skills element.
Can I come in a little bit as well? When people talk about that, I always think it's with the sort of underlying undercurrent that therefore people aren't picking the courses where the jobs are. That's the sort of, that's what that really means. But if I'll use our college as an example. I don't know, 5,000 full-time students come here every year, cross-section of Middlesbrough, without the high-end academic, although we do have some A-levels, it's a small part of what we do. Okay, if we could pick up those young people we have today and move forward 30 years, I know that quite a large proportion will be in cleaning, security, call centres, warehousing, because that's the makeup of our economy, 20-30%. Now, if we had a course brochure, roll up, come to Middlesbrough College, in 10 years you can be a cleaner, in 20 years you could be aware. That's what we should be doing if we were to do the spirit of what this policy is trying to get us to do. Now, we don't do that. What we do is raise aspirations, sell the dream, tell people to come, show them all the data about the jobs, and then later on we'll pick them up in our sector skills academies as adults when they've been long-term unemployed and retrain them back into those sectors that they were inevitably going to be in, because that's where the work is. So I really think we need to flip the narrative. The undercurrent is colleges are doing the wrong thing, but actually we are doing the right thing. It's about how we keep those transferable skills, which is what actually happens in all our education systems, the value of education, so they can move from a public services course into, hospitality or warehousing or the army or the police.
Thanks, Zoe. There's another question about kind of about learners again, really, and it's another part of the sort of the logic behind this, I think, which is as well as the one Craig and Zoe have just outlined, is people make decisions about the salary that they can earn in a certain sector or a certain job, and I'm really interested in whether any of you think that's true. And if you've got any evidence that that's what people do, because I've yet to find any. I'm genuinely, it's always difficult to work on anecdotes, isn't it? But with 3 kids who went to university, none of them looked to see what the earnings outcomes would be from the courses they went on, and yet the government is absolutely fixated on it. And without being unkind to them, they were much more interested in the social life they'd have at university, because that's the reality of a teenager, isn't it? So is there something that we're we're setting something up here that's meant to be about learner choice and about all the other things we talked about, when actually it isn't what learners are motivated to do. It doesn't motivate them to choose courses and so on. I'm interested in any views on that.
So, David, I don't have any data for the questions you ask with respect to, do people choose a certain type of learning because of, better pay. What I can tell you, though, there was a survey a couple of years ago of learners in higher education. And the questions was, what do you expect of your as an outcome? And majority was a job. When they asked the same question to colleges faculty and university faculty, completely different. If people were in the college system, so in the TVET system, if you prefer, it was all about jobs. It was all about labor market. It was all about, the synergies between the needs of communities and ensuring that the learners had a job to go to. Universities, it was very, very different. It was for, the betterment of society. It was for the greater good and all that. And so this created a lot of, how do I say, tension between the two. And if we look back at the pandemic, what happened, it's still the case, like more than ever. People, what they want is a job at the end. So if they do upskill and reskill, it's to have a better job or to find a job. It is, it's when they retire that maybe they will think otherwise, and they will think, okay, I want to learn, I want to satisfy my own curiosity. And during the pandemic, we had an interesting experience for Canada, because I told you that Canada is of provincial and territorial jurisdiction. So we don't have things that are national per se. But because there was such a shortage of personal support workers, the federal government, in fact, approached us as an association to create micro-credentials that could be available online across the country. And so this was a first, because we created this curriculum for these micro-credentials with 15 colleges from across the country. And now the learners are taking this 6 weeks online micro-credential, and then they can work in different parts of the country. But what is the most magical is that the learner gets assessed at the end of their training and at the end of their 3 months of work placement. And what happened, they enter into the regular provincial program, depending where they are at. So what I mean, they get credits or credentials for what they have acquired. So when you ask me, what does the pandemic change? I do not think that this would have ever happened pre-pandemic. But the pandemic has forced things to go faster and has forced things to ensure that people are upskilled and reskilled in the best possible way. And we know that in the college system, if we don't do it, private provider will do it faster and they will do something about it. So I really think that we need to ensure that whatever we do it in the most efficient way as possible. Because last month, we've heard that us in our own country, there's a bank that has announced a learning platform. And I thought, what? A bank is going into being a learning provider now?
Yeah, well, Amazon will be there soon, I would imagine. The other dimension of this, and I think a number of you mentioned it, is there's something for me about the timescales, and Craig, like it sounds like in Australia, in the UK, we've got this longitudinal employment outcomes data that tracks learners through the tax system. So you can say, someone who was at Middlesbrough College 5 years ago, 10 years ago, what are they earning now? And how does that kind of benchmark against other people from similar backgrounds? So it's a rich data. It links to their school history, it links to their qualification outcomes at all levels. So it's incredibly rich, and it means you can track people for throughout their lives, literally. I think we've got the next. We've got people for 10 years now, kind of been in the labour market. My question, I suppose, is because it exists. Is it a good measure of the input, the impact, the kind of experience in a college? And what's the best timescale? Because 6 months might be too short, 12 months might be better, 2 years might be too long. What is it we're really trying to measure here? So Craig, I don't know if you want to have a pop at that, because you talked about the longer term.
Yeah. What I was trying to get at is, I guess I think we've still got this too simplistic approach about what is the vocational education intervention model, as I was saying, this sort of 1+1, or this sort of linear model. And then of course in Australia, what we've suffered with, we've over the last, up until COVID, we hadn't had a recession in 26 years. So as soon as you measure the success of VET against employment, well, of course you're going to succeed, because it was a raging employment market. So does that mean now, because of COVID, that VET's a failure because people aren't getting a job? It's some funny logic in there somewhere. I'd prefer somewhere, and this is difficult in traditional industry-based VET, to be able to say, let's look at the value add. What are those broader capabilities and skills that we've given them? And that's where I think I'd be able to go. And that would almost, I think, force you back to what Zoe was talking about. Maybe let's focus more on those transferable skills that give somebody greater chance of sort of success and mobility through the labour market. One of the reasons that economists here in Australia say that wages have been suppressed and actually economic growth has been dampened as well is people are too scared to move between jobs. And that's actually what drives economy, innovation, and all that sort of stuff. And so whether that's because they think they're captured with skills that are captured in one industry or one occupation or whatever, I'm not exactly sure. But I think there's a general movement to bring vocational education down to broader transferable skills at present. And I think that's where we'll try to head. And when you do that, you've got better chance of saying, what's the value add? What's the learning value add on the individual?
Yeah, I mean, that's really helpful. I mean, I think the other thing that worries me a lot about this is what we've seen in programs previously, and certainly in some of the employment programs of, where you cream off the people who are kind of easier to work with, easier to get outcomes for, and you park the ones that are really difficult. And we've certainly seen that before in a sort of an outcomes payment type system. And I don't think DfE is suggesting that, by the way, for this, but nevertheless, if you want to look good, what's the chances if you're working in London, for instance, with black young men where there's a 40% unemployment rate? What's the chances of working with long-term sick people who are completely underrepresented in the labour market because the health system's not supporting them in an active way? So there's a real equality and inclusion agenda here, which worries me a lot. That somehow you need to get that bit right, but then that sounds like you start having to set targets for inputs as well as targets for outcomes, and it gets incredibly complex. So the question I suppose I've got, it's kind of a rhetorical question, but I'm interested if anyone wants to have a stab at it. So I'm looking at you, Stephen, really, is how and it's a genuine question, how do we get to an outcome-based model that doesn't have parking and creaming, and doesn't mean less inclusion and less equality?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think the kind of every system has a set of perverse incentives implicit within it, and what you need to do is try and minimize them or get the least worst perverse ones, and then deal with them when they're in play. And for example, we wouldn't declare that all colleges' hospitality provision just fell down in quality and was terrible in spring 2020, would we? We'd say, well, there was a lockdown, so there weren't any jobs for anyone to go to. So that kind of the context, whether it's demographics, local economy, big macroeconomic trends, you kind of, the risk is you end up with sort of wither capitalism as a sort of discussion, and the short-termism of our finance model and blah, blah, blah. I guess where I would come from, there's a real risk that what we end up with is a simple and simplistic set of headline measures that are so simple and simplistic that they don't get published or used and they're hidden away. And then it's kind of, well, what was the point of any of this? So what we argued is, how do you bridge that gap between being simplistic or being so complex that you can't see the wood for the trees? And you know, Zoe's got 59 spreadsheets to fill in that still don't tell the story. I guess our sort of halfway house, or attempt to bridge some of that gap, is number one, do it slowly and test some stuff out. Don't just say from next year, this is the thing and we're all going to judge you on all of it. So kind of test it out and do it with people rather than to people. And then secondly, we argued for some, whether it's an added value measure, as Craig was talking about, or whether it's a relative measure, or whether it's identifying some priority groups and saying, we care about the headline results, but we also care that priority groups are properly represented and not getting much worse outcomes than the average. You know, let's try some of those things out so we can kind of see which ways help to bridge the gap. It may all turn out that, you know what, it's too difficult, but it feels like there are ways to do this. There's lessons we can learn from other areas, like you know, schools, for example, and how we measure outcomes there to the extent that we do. So let's try some of those different measures out that contextualize and say, we really don't want the parking and creaming that goes on too often when you start to do more of this sort of stuff. And we've seen that in DWP programs time and time again. So let's try some of these things out, test them in a light touch way that doesn't mean that if something goes marginally wrong, the college suddenly loses all of its funding and is publicly named and shamed or something. And then just see how that develops over time. Yeah, no, thanks. So what, you got any thoughts on that, and how would you want to be incentivized, if that's the right word? I don't want to sound patronizing, but that's in a sense, you know, how would...
No, I mean, I am genuinely really interested in all of this, and I really like looking at the data and the trends, and, you know, it works if you look at data, it changes. You know, we've done it internally with achievement gaps, and we've narrowed achievement gaps. So I do understand the value of looking at this, but a lot of what is this simplicity, it's going to have so many perverse incentives. And the alternative of the detail is going to be too bureaucratic. So I can see the balancing out that you're sort of grappling with there, Stephen, in terms of pulling a proposal together, which is why my sort of start suggestion is let's do both of those actually, but do them in a hidden way because of the unintended consequences. And I say that just from a regional perspective, particularly with travel at the moment. You know, I think there was 10% difference in employment outcomes in a college in the northeast of England to the southeast. Let's exaggerate that. Let's pick a college that's at a low level in a deprived area in the northeast and compare it with a college at a higher level on different sectors in an affluent area. You'll find a 20-25% gap. And you can go on forever. And I think you said at the end there about, well, we'll create some exceptions, and that's where it will inevitably become a beast again, because there will be so many exceptions to make it sophisticated. So really, I am excited about looking at it. I'm just concerned about the dangers, and I've actually seen the dangers in schools, because people tend to treat Ofsted as an almost gospel. They don't treat the performance tables as a gospel that are public. They do treat Ofsted as a gospel, but the lag in times, there's many instances where people have moved schools because of an Ofsted, and actually might be, if you look at the data, moving into a school that's poorer, but they look at a headline. So headlines do actually generate some behaviour, and kind of get too simple, generate the wrong behaviour. And at a time of levelling up and trying to improve social mobility, I just fear it might do the reverse. So I think let's work on it, let's test it, but let's be very careful about institutionalizing it and making it public. And I think if we want to build a trust, and that's where I go back to the start, the trust for me is the underlying factor. I think it's what started this policy. I think we all agree it needs to develop right across the system, locally and nationally. I'm just not sure that this is going to do that. And I think there's better ways.
Yes, Denise, yeah.
Yeah, David, it's a fabulous question, and I fully agree with Stephen and Zoe, because the focus on outcomes, it has benefits if it is transparent and it takes into account vulnerable groups. Because, we know that for learners and funders, they want to know the outcomes of programs. However, does it mean that colleges would start to be discriminatory when it's time for the admissions on who they accept on the basis of the likelihood of the student completing and succeeding? What happens to the late bloomers? We all have known those late bloomers in our life in education. Or what happens to those that have more challenges? Will they be denied education? So for me, this is very, very critical, because at the end of the day, we are there to ensure access to education for all citizens. And it's important that we have inclusive strategies and programs that take into account, the diversity of learners, their cultural heritage, their ethnic heritage. I know that in Canada, for example, we have over 300 credential programs tailored specifically to Indigenous learners and communities. And so, yes, I believe outcomes are important, but flexibility is key. And we need to do it in an inclusive way. If not, unfortunately, institutions may need to may begin to choose who they admit.
Yeah,
and we don't want that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Denise, and I think that's very powerful. I'm going to try and be generous to politicians now, because I think one of the things that's quite difficult is what do you do if you don't measure outcomes? Because at the moment, what we seem to measure is qualification achievement. And it's not as if that's a perfect set of measures, And Craig, I was struck yesterday when you were talking about how many learners in Australia are doing, basic first aid or, manual handling or, health and safety. And it looks great, doesn't it? Several 100,000 learners are doing qualifications, and they just happen to be one-day qualifications. The outcome of which is what they stay in a job. There's no transformation. So we have to be careful not to just get caught into the outcome stuff is difficult. Therefore, we should stick with qualifications, because I think qualifications is a really poor indicator, and the success rate measure, qualification achievement rate measure, can be manipulated in all sorts of ways. As well, and perhaps is a bit even more opaquely. So there's something about how do we get this balance right that perhaps Stephen was trying to talk about. And I think there's something that it's about the sanctions or the consequences bit that matters a lot in here. Because Zoe, what really strikes me, and one of the reasons why we kind of asked you was because I think it's clear that you do really worry about the outcomes. You're really, really looking at as much data as you can. You're thinking about it. It's part of the strategy. It's long term. It's deep. It's questioning. It's open, and it's kind of how do we drive that sort of behaviour in your peers, the college leaders, because that's what we want. I think that's what politicians want. They want every college leader to be saying, how do we get the best for our community, our employers, our labour market, our learners, etc. But at the moment, we've got no mechanism to do that, because, there's no, you do it, but you don't have to do it because no one's asking you to do it.
But colleagues across the Tees Valley do it.
Yeah.
I mean, genuinely, other college, we have, all of us have these conversations, and all of us have shifted provision, and all of us are moving into priority sectors, and then all of us are hitting the KPIs that are set locally, and none of it's improving our employment opportunities. And I just think that's an interesting thing, because if the jobs aren't there, the jobs aren't there, and then you get to social mobility and movement and ability to move. So I think it's a really complex, there's too many other factors at play, but I genuinely think we should be doing it, and I genuinely think we should be talking about it. It's where and how that concerns me. I like it the way we're doing it now, because it's creating a really creative, constructive debate locally between our skills policymakers locally. Hopefully, I mean, this discussion is an illustration of it nationally as well, that it isn't simple, that it needs discussion and debate to get to a very rounded, nuanced solution. You know, so we're now using our adult devolution to fund HGV drivers. You know, and that's a flexibility locally, isn't that great? But what, you know, the sorts of discussions that we're getting to are really, really much more deep. But a published data dashboard with a sort of linear outcome, I don't think would generate that conversation.
Or in fact, the proposal, I think Stephen said it earlier, is a single skills measure. So, you know, you'll get what, you know, 1 or 3 or 7. I mean, which is even more worrying, perhaps. You know, so I think what I'm hearing a lot is the conversation that needs to be had, and the debate that needs to be had about outcomes is what needs to be generated much more. And I suppose my question is, you know, can we get the system to be a conversation between someone who is accountable to the minister directly, if you like, or indirectly? So the minister can go, yeah, I'm comfortable it's happening, because I know that I've got a team of people who arranged in whatever way, who are going out and having those conversations and challenging, you know, but not hitting people around the head or taking money away because there's a simplistic approach to it. And it's trying to get, how do you try and get that system operating? I think that's really important.
This is why, if I can jump in, this is why, I mean, the examples in the report, so Canada, Australia, Ireland, the US, we could have picked other countries, all published this data, and their systems haven't sort of collapsed into the ground, unless Craig or Denise may contradict me on that. But and none of them are perfect, but it's kind of what you measure. So the kind of context, whether it's added value or whatever it happens to be, is really important. So don't just sort of publish a headline thing and then say off you go. But also what you do with it. So that's why, like, so for example, in the sort of Canadian example of labour market development agreements and the sort of Irish example about strategic performance agreements, the Scottish example, which I've mentioned about outcome agreements, that's why the language kind of matters. And so I slightly worry about the language of accountability agreements, because what that says is that the Department for Education is going to hold colleges accountable, and this is a sort of waving a sort of red spreadsheet in front of you. So I think it's kind of what you measure and it's how you do, well, and what you do with it are the two key questions, but they are not impossible to answer. And the experience of other countries, whilst none of them are perfect, and you can't just do this and say, right, mission accomplished, hang out the banners, you know, because there's no more stuff you've got to do as well. It's not impossible.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we're coming towards the end in a minute. I'll give everybody 60 seconds to say something in conclusion in just a second. So I'll say something for 60 seconds to give you a chance to think. But what strikes me most in this is that the government wants this to happen, and Treasury want this to happen. And Stephen said that right at the beginning. And they do want to do it in a way, I think genuinely, that it frees up some of the absolutely mad bureaucracy we've got, and the kind of the audit regime we've got in England, which measures everything and knows the value of nothing. You know, it's kind of that classic, we'll measure whether, you know, little Johnny or little Jenny sat on a seat, you know, enough times to draw down the money, but we don't give a hoot about whether they learned anything, you know, got an outcome, went on to anything, you know. So I think it seems to me there is we need to come up with a solution on this. And Stephen, the thing I liked most was, let's work on it together. Let's try something. Let's do it in a safe space so that it doesn't have kind of stupid, quick consequences that could be negative. And let's hopefully, with the spending review in a month's time, do it with some more money coming into the system possibly, let's be optimistic about it. So I was going to just give you literally 60 seconds to do a concluding statement. So I'll go in the order we had. So Craig first, if that's all right.
All right, thanks, David, and again, thanks for the opportunity to comment. Yeah, you've picked the sort of the comment I was going to make. Governments are going to do this anyway, so try to get ahead of the game and make that a sophisticated conversation, because it will expose all the other elements that give rise to success. And just very much as an aside, I've been hooked this last little while in watching this TV series called Ted Lasso, which in some ways, for those who are familiar with that quite quirky series, he's come in and actually said, against the pressure of the measure of winning, he withstood all that pressure to say, no, I'm here to build the individual. It's an interesting message for us in terms of what we're on about fundamentally.
Brilliant. Thanks, Craig. And thanks for joining us today. Denise.
So very quickly, you're right, no matter what, they will do it. So I would put pressure to make sure that this is transparent, that it is useful, and that it's useful for learners, and it's useful for communities, because if not, what's the purpose? And what I hope will happen is that it won't be a determining factor for the funding, but more a benchmark for improvement at the individual level of each institution. So, because at the end of the day, Zoe, with what she shared with us, she cannot be compared to another college in London. It doesn't make sense. She needs different types of indicators to measure the progress. And sometimes it's essential skills that were acquired. It may not be, the technical skills, but the essential skills may provide that person with a job in the future.
Brilliant. Thanks, Denise. Zoe.
Oh, I don't think this is going to be very inspirational, really, but yeah, just be really clear about the problem we're trying to solve and what's behind the driver for this, which I think I'm probably picking it up from your report, I'm probably picking it up from other areas, is around trust and evidence-based for funding. So I understand that and the drivers for it. If you want to build trust, there's two different things there. If you want to build trust, you have to have the deep and meaningful conversations, and that won't be anything simple. So you have this dichotomy of things, and I think we've got to decide which of those two things are most important. Building the trust and deepening the conversations and resolving the underlying issues, or having accurate data for which to drive funding. Personally, I think you can do both. That's why I finished at the start, but it has to be, and I'm not saying don't do it at a provider level, do it, but don't publish it. Have it at a regional level, understand and have those discussions, which is the whole point of the LSIPs, about what that particular circumstance is, and then use it to deepen the conversation and build trust.
Yeah, I think getting the data right around the purpose and the strategy, and then having the conversation, I think is incredibly important, actually. But that really helpful. Stephen.
Yeah, well, a huge thanks to Craig and Denise for sharing their experiences. It's kind of I love hearing about the experiences in other countries, and I think whilst you can never copy and paste systems across, there's so much we can all learn from each other. So I'm really keen to keep that conversation going. And huge thanks to Zoe for her input to the earlier roundtable we had when we were developing this, as well as today, because this is about, how's this going to work in practice, or what's the pitfalls, or what could we do instead? And it kind of makes it a richer discussion. I guess for me, the government's proposals there's a risk that they could be either a catastrophe because they're done in a simplistic way and used as a stick to hit people with, or a complete irrelevance because they're just ignored and nobody does anything with it. But I think there's an opportunity in the middle to make them sensible, to get something positive that tells the great story of how amazing FE is and makes the case for that investment. But I guess the last point I'd make is that, which I think Zoe was talking about as well, and we talk about in the report, is we can't end up with just a system where we've now got a dashboard that the DFE can hold people accountable for. It needs to go it needs to not be just about that, but it also needs to go alongside the longer term increased investment and the simplification and the freeing up from some of the other stuff that David, you were talking about before. So we must make sure that all of those things fit together. But I think there is a real opportunity here. And thanks to everybody for taking part in the discussion.
Thanks, Stephen. And my thanks to everybody as well. I'm going to wrap up really quickly. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your questions. It's incredibly important we carry on talking about this. And it's really important that we share across different countries as well, as we always try to, because we haven't got a monopoly on wisdom in any one country. And we can learn from successes as well as mistakes. So let's work together. Let's carry on talking about it. I think, colleges, as I said, want to be accountable for what they do, because what they do is fantastic. It is transformational. It is an incredibly important part of our society and our economy. So let's get that bit right. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a good evening or whatever time it is in Canada and Australia. Cheers for now. Thanks.